We are talking today with George Marshall. George Marshall is the co-founder of the Climate Outreach and Information Network, based in Oxford, England. Over the past 25 years, he has worked at all levels of the environmental movement, including in senior positions for Greenpeace USA and the Rainforest Foundation. He writes widely on climate change issues, including articles for The New Statesman, The Guardian, New Scientist, and The Ecologist. And he is also the author of Carbon Detox and is here to talk about his new book, Don't Even Think About It, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change. George, thank you very much for coming and spending time with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me on your program.
So to start out, tell us, what was the motivation in writing your new book, Don't Even Think About It?
You know, I spend a lot of time talking with people about climate change. Of course, it's part of my work. Always we're trying not just to help people to understand it, but to motivate people around change. And one of the things that you find if you work on this issue is, first of all, that it's hard to motivate people around. That people will express a concern. They say, yeah, that sounds really serious, but somehow they don't seem to engage with it. You also find, of course, that some people are violently opposed for no clear reason to it, that they have taken hold of the issue and they see it as a personal affront. But I think of particular interest is this large area of people in between, of people who say, yes, I guess that's kind of a problem, but somehow it just doesn't seem to stick with them. In fact, quite often what happens if you talk with people is the conversation just dies. And you have to wonder why that is. I mean, we've been talking about it now for 25 years. The issue's been around, of course, for far longer than that. This is a very serious issue. I mean, there's no question at all about it. And there's no question that anyone who works on this issue, in particular the climate scientists who they've got no axe to grind, this is just what they happen to work on, are deeply, deeply concerned about it. But despite all of these attempts to try and get this information over to people, despite all of the sign-on letters of world scientists or, the president saying this is a huge issue, still the vast majority of people simply do not seem to be engaged. Or rather, they engage at one level, and people now will tell you a lot about climate change, but they don't seem to feel it. And I guess what started me on this book was the key issue, which is, how is it possible to know something and not to feel it? How is it possible to know that something is a real problem or a threat and not to feel it? And I guess the title also, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change, explores the possibility that there is something in the way that this engages with us and the way that our brains work that simply doesn't move us into action. Somehow that this particular issue just seems to not work with the way that our brains are constructed to perceive threat.
So how did you go about researching this? Who did you talk to help you understand this?
The starting point really was people who are experts in the field. Of course, people who are leading climate scientists, also people who are leading experts in cognitive psychology. The operating of the brain, the way that the brain perceives threats and risk. And I had the honor of speaking to some of the world experts in that. Not least of all, Professor Daniel Kahneman, who your listeners might know from a book which has been in the New York bestseller list for over a year now, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. Kahneman is rightly recognized as being the overwhelming expert in this. He won a Nobel Prize for his work on how our brains are biased in the decisions we make. Daniel Kahneman is very interesting on this. I had a long conversation with him. His view is that climate change is the perfect problem for us. He would say that the evidence of his research is that we are very bad at dealing with things that are in the future. We are very bad at dealing with things which involve losses, not gains. That's to say that we're risk averse. That we are very bad at dealing with things which are uncertain. And he says a problem which involves us making sacrifices now in order not to have gains, but to have less of future loss. In other words, it's a loss now against a loss in the future, but set some long way in the future with a degree of uncertainty about it, is, as far as he's concerned, the worst possible combination of all of the things we're lousy at. And he said he's extremely, extremely pessimistic. I don't share that. I don't share that pessimism, as we'll talk about in a minute. But I do recognize that we have a serious problem there. I also spoke with people who are experts in the psychology of how we perceive threat, or rather how we socially construct threat, particularly Professor Paul Slovic, who's, again, the world leader in this field. He's based in the University of Oregon. And he says climate change, again, is a big problem. He says that there are a number of criteria of things by which we perceive threats, that threats, for example, of things which induce a sense of dread, risk, like a sense of very strong fear, things which are invisible, things which are caused by technology, things which are outside our control. And these things make us extremely fearful. And I said, well, doesn't that fit climate change then? Aren't those all things that fit climate change? Surely climate change should be a perfect match. And he says, well, there's a real problem with climate change, which is that the impacts of it come in a form that actually we're very familiar with. That extreme weather events might be frightening at the time, but they're things that we are psychologically and socially conditioned to deal with. And so when we have an extreme event, it feels horrible at the time, whether it's the drought here in California or it's extreme flooding, as we had last year in Britain, or it's kind of a hurricane. That is very frightening at the time it happens. But nonetheless, we are used to picking ourselves up, dusting ourselves up, often starting all over again. He said if it turned the sky purple, then people would go, oh my God. If it gave us cancer, they'd probably go, oh my God. But actually what happens is that they just go, wow, that was horrible. And that becomes the new normal. And this is a big danger of climate change. That you remember when we were talking about the extreme cold that came down, the polar vortex, I think people called it. I was speaking with a climatologist, and he pointed out actually that before climate change really started kicking in, about 30 years ago, that the polar vortex was not an extreme weather event at all. But what made us perceive this as being an extreme event was the fact that we have now become so used to warm winters that actually when we have something which is an extremely cold one, that we go, oh my God, this is extreme. In other words, what happens is that our sense of the baseline of what is normal just keeps shifting according to what happens. And so the seasons keep changing, the weather keeps changing, and we just take our idea of what is an extreme event from the previous one. Already I can see in my own country, in Britain, the expectation of what is now an extreme flood is set not by the weather when I was a child, but by the weather of the last 10 years. So, but I didn't just speak with people who were experts in the psychology. I also had some very interesting conversations with people who completely disagree with me and everything that I stand for. I really made a point to go out and speak with strong opponents of action on climate change, the professional contrarians and campaigners against action on climate change, people who have very conservative politics, which leads them to deny it. I had a completely bizarre and amazing day with the Texan Tea Party, which was actually a lot of fun, but also quite an eye-opener, I have to say. And I think that it's a privilege of being an outsider, particularly of being English, that actually sometimes you can approach these people and talk to people who it might be quite hard for Americans to do, because they're kind of interested to see what you're like and what you have to say. And of course, Texans are very hospitable anyway. I really enjoyed talking with them and really having the opportunity to listen carefully to why they chose to, well, not just ignore climate change, but very actively resist the science behind it. And these are not ill-informed people. They are, despite what the people who oppose the Tea Party would say, they're not ignorant, they're not badly educated, and they're not uncaring or unsensitive. They're people who, for various reasons, have decided that climate change is opposed to their values and what they care about, and therefore they're actively resisting it. And I think this is a tragedy, because regardless of their politics, these are people who are very energized, very involved with their community, very involved with politics, and very interested in making political change. And these are people I would like to have on board for work on climate change.
So when you say they are resisting climate change, they're resisting it as if it's like some kind of PR campaign, or they are not accepting the science at all?
I think there's several things happening. Climate change clearly has a threat to them. We know that to take action on climate change is going to require some changes in our lives, and we know that that will probably realistically involve some degree of national and international government limits on how we can choose to live. So obviously, if you have an ideology which is opposed to the constraint of government, you're going to find this hard and challenging. But I think it's also more than that. I think that they see climate change as something which is owned and monopolized by people of the left, and they have therefore come to see it, therefore, as something that they should automatically oppose on the basis that people of all political stripes consistently stand against and oppose the positions of the other side, even when these things are purely symbolic. Part of the problem of climate change is that it lends itself to this, because it's a particularly, I call it a jelly mold issue. It's a wobbly, slippery issue that will readily take the form and shape that you choose it to have. And that means that from their point of view, the shape they choose it to have is that it's this opposing issue, an issue that belongs to someone else that doesn't belong to them. Now, of course, climate change could be and should be their issue. Climate change is a fundamental threat to freedom. It's a fundamental threat to property. It's a fundamental threat to the landscape that they spoke to me very passionately about, the Texan countryside they were so proud of, the way of life of many of them in farming or in ranching, and that threat is there. But the problem is that they become obsessed with the idea that it is actually that the threat is something which is posed by their opponents. And really the opportunity for this is to find ways that they themselves have, of course, to find ways of reframing this in terms of something which is relevant to them.
So talk about then the framing that one is using when you're basically talking to what I'll call members of the choir, people that I know that accept that climate change is real, but aren't really doing anything about it, aren't taking any concrete steps. What's the difference between you and those people?
I think it's a very fair question to say, what is it that switches people on to action on climate change, or what leaves people in a kind of sense of passivity? I mean, really, it's the challenge to the argument of saying climate change is inherently difficult for people to deal with, is to point out that a minority of people have no difficulty in terms of dealing with it, but they become passionately involved with it and very, very active, and that they're dedicating their lives to it. If this was really an impossible issue to deal with, then those people wouldn't be there. So clearly, there is something in either in those people or the social construction. Well, I don't think there's anything special about those of us who care about climate change. I think we're people the same as other people are. I think that politically it is easier for people who maybe have more liberal politics to accept the threat contained in it. Of course, it stood to reason that environmentalists were the first to pick this issue up, because it looks like an environmental issue. It concerns pollution produced by industrialized lifestyles, often produced by very large corporations, and it has extreme effects on the natural environment. So it fitted very neatly within the existing framework of an environmental issue. What was unfortunate is that then it became defined as an environmental issue, and even more so. So it started being an environmental issue, and it was talked about by the environmental correspondent on a newspaper. The environment desk would do it. The minister or the secretary for the environment would deal with it, and it became part of an environmental policy. And every time that was repeated, it kept saying this is environment, environment, environment. Climate change should never really have been those things. It was a major mistake. It was. It's a fundamental resource issue. It's an issue concerning the resource of the atmosphere and the resource of the climate. It is something which is shared at every level between people. But as soon as like I said, it's an issue which takes up the shape you make it. As soon as you shape it as an environmental issue, then people who are concerned about the environment go, yes, that's my kind of issue. We then start sticking polar bears all over it. As I say in the book, polar bears, or bears generally, have no place in the campaigns of human rights organisations. They never have a bear as a symbol of anything, or people working on gender issues, for example, or people working on social rights and equality issues, or indeed, actually maybe probably people in the Tea Party might have it as a symbol for something to shoot. I don't know, but they're we gave it the shape and form that we liked the look of. And so for me, as somebody who has worked all my life in the environmental movement, it felt like a very natural issue to pick up. What has happened, though, is that in the course of really working very hard on this and talking with a wide range of other people, I've now come to think that that was a major mistake. I understand it and I accept it, I see what is necessary, but I really wish it had not had that form from the outset, for we'd recognise this was something much, much bigger and much, much wider.
So how do we address that at this point in time?
There's something I haven't said which is necessary before I answer that, which is that, I guess maybe still like an answer to the last question, that there are people who get this issue, there are people who are fundamentally opposed to it, and there's a very wide range of people in the middle who aren't talking about it. The surveys show that a third of people can't recall ever having had a single conversation with anyone about climate change. We know that of the 2/3 of people who maybe have at some point talked about climate change, virtually none of them have ever talked about it with anyone other than their immediate friends and family networks. And even then, it's pretty clear that this is not exactly a major subject. It might have appeared in some random conversation. So I think we have to say that the challenge, the initial challenge, is actually even to get people recognizing it and allowing the fact that a conversation exists. And I think in this sense it's not unlike other struggles where there is a collective silence, whether that is a silence around social rights or whether that's a silence around things like sexual abuse. Whether there was long in my own country a silence against racism, whereby a kind of level of just background racism was just accepted as the norm. And then there was some key point where people started saying, you know what, that joke's racist, it's not funny. They started communicating with each other and they started expressing values and commitment and a different sense of doing things with each other. And of course change comes on many, many levels. It would be stupid to say climate change changes because of a conversation. It changes because laws are set down. It changes because people's behaviours change. It changes because people have different choice as well. It changes because people do have access to transit, or they do have access to different ways of heating their homes or driving their cars, and so on. But I think it also comes because people are prepared to openly talk about it, and there is the space and the opportunity to do so. So I say to people, one of the things that you can do if you're concerned about this is to ensure that you make that space, that you put it on the agenda at work, that you actively bring it into conversations, and that you do so not from the point of arguing from the science, but arguing from your own personal conviction. I'm persuaded that, and again, the research supports this, that really the key way that people become persuaded is by the evidence of what the people around them think and feel about things. So it's not really about having an argument where you say, well, don't you know that 97% of scientists say this, or that sea levels will rise by this much. I think it's really much more a matter of saying, well, this is what, I'm convinced of this. I've seen and heard enough. I'm convinced we have a real problem. I like this language of conviction too, because I think that people in the end are reached and moved and excited by the fact that people feel things strongly, even if they don't agree with them on other things. I mean, I know that when I meet people who have very strong convictions, I'm always moved and excited by them, even when I don't necessarily agree with them. I want to hear more. I'm interested about what makes people feel so strongly about it. And I think that's the way to potentially open it up.
So it sounds like we need to change the environment of those we interact with then. That kind of a smaller environmental circle of our friends and peers and acquaintances.
Again, change needs to come on so many different levels that I don't want to just say that's where it happens, but let's just say that is definitely one level. I can't see that we're going to move very far without having a lot more people involved. We could maybe have a grassroots kind of resistance movement, a very, very strong movement. I think that's important. I've worked for the environmental movement for many years and for many social rights issues. I want to see that happen. But I still feel that in order to get real systemic change which is necessary for this, but we're going to have to take a lot more people with us. And I think that means that the conversation does have to be happening in new areas and within our communities. One of the ways, for example, that this can happen is by having a much stronger conversation about how we're going to deal with and cope with the changes that we're already seeing. How are we going to prepare and defend our communities and our ways of life for the weather changes which are already coming around? There's great opportunity around, for example, the drought which is happening now, for people to really start to talk about long-term preparedness. And in a way, this bypasses the immediate argument about, well, is it happening or isn't it happening? It's pretty clear something is happening, so let's just talk about how we can be ready for it. And I think that's a way to at least open up that conversation.
Do you see people taking concrete action, walking the walk, as key to winning over others? I read that you recently, or maybe not so recently, converted your house over to make it more energy efficient.
It's very important for me. Let's take a step back and say the thing which I think is critical is that we speak from a position of personal conviction. We say, I'm convinced. I've seen it. This is absolutely central to who I am. Of course, this sounds, I bring it out into the open straight openly now, this sounds almost religious. And of course it's not. We're not talking climate change as science. It's something real. Religion's a personally held faith. It's a different thing. But there is a way, however, that people of religious faith say that they wear their faith. That they say, this is what I believe, and this is what it feels like, and this is why it's important to me. I think we have to do that for climate change as well. In order to do that, we do have to be consistent with how we live and what we do. We do have to be saying, yeah, sometimes this stuff is great, sometimes this stuff is hard, but it's important for me that I do it. If you look at it with a little bit of distance, the issue as to whether your house is insulated and whether you make a flight and so on doesn't actually amount to, I don't want to say a hill of beans. Is that the Casablanca phrase? A heap of beans in this world. But at another level, it is very, very important for your own sense of personal consistency and commitment. So for me, insulating my house, so I'll model it for you now. For me, because I'm personally convinced climate change is a huge issue, and it's one I want to be actively involved with. I want to be building, I want to be working towards the world I want to see. So therefore, for me, insulating my home was very important. I did so. My house ended up using a third as much energy as it did before, and that wasn't about saving money, although it was actually quite nice to save money, because in the end, over the course of the next 10 years, that paid for everything. But it was also more comfortable, warmer, healthier, cleaner house. All of these benefits. I want to be able to share that with people because the benefits are strong. I think there's real problems when we have an inconsistency between what we say and what we do, because that creates an area of personal guilt. I've already talked about how we have these social silences, but we also have personal silences around areas where we feel conflicted, where there's a dissonance between what we say and what we do. So, for example, some of my colleagues in the wider movement who fly a lot, or sometimes fly not just for work, but also needlessly for personal holidays, because they fancy like going to the mountains and going climbing. I think that compromises them, not just in the eyes of others, but also in terms of their own work. Because, of course, what happens is they create a silence around flying. I'm always interested talking with people who work on climate change, but finding that but they're quite prepared to talk about climate change, so there's no silence around that. But if you talk about flying, suddenly the conversation seems to just die, or they start to get very apologetic. And that's bad news, because of course then when they're recommending to other people what other people should do, or how do we get out of this problem, or how do we solve it, mysteriously flying doesn't appear on the agenda. So when, for example, Al Gore, who I recognize has done a great deal of good work on this, but when, for example, Al Gore's fuel bills come out and it's clear that he's got several houses running at the same time and running up just mind-bogglingly big energy bills, I think there's a problem there. I think there's a problem there not just in terms of the quality, his qualities as a communicator, but I think there's a problem there in terms of his own consistency inside himself. So, yeah, I think walking the walk. I think not just in a not in a kind of like in a in a pious way, but because it's important for us to be clear and consistent with who we are and what we do and why we're doing it and what's important. And of course, now I can come on the show and I can say I had a great house. Now, to get on your show, of course, I've had to fly across from another continent. That is an issue. So I think there's another thing here, which is to say, sure, this stuff is hard. There's no black and white on it. Sometimes we do sometimes have to do things. We have to get the kids to school. Sometimes we do have to have cars, and some people living in the country have to use a lot of car. There are balances here, so let's not beat ourselves up too much about it, but let's recognise the balances are there. For me to come over to the States, I thought long and hard about whether I felt that I could justify to myself making a flight. And it's like, well, yeah, it gets me onto this program. It gets me to travel around America, to meet a whole bunch of people. What I try and do is I try and do as much as possible with that. I say, yes, okay, there's a cost associated with this, and I'll make the most of it. If an issue came up, for example, about flying over to New York to go shopping, then the answer would be, well, no, I can't justify that on any front. So, yeah, there's always a balance, I think.
And then it would seem to be then the next step would be as individuals, then we collectively shape our policies so that when one of us does need to hop from one continent to the other, we come up with an appropriate technology that can do so without adding to the current problem with climate change.
We're going to have to recognise that we can't travel around as much as we do anyway. End of chat. This is one of the reasons why people don't like this issue. Sorry to say it, we can't. It might be that the technology is not the technology which enables me to get here in a different way, but the technology which enables me to, to simply stay at home. Let's put it this way: if we could get our way of living back to where it was in the 1970s, with modern technology, with all of the various clever ways that we have now for using less energy, we would be a very, very long way to dealing with this issue. And the reason I say that, because it's interesting, is that according to all of the measures, and this happens again and again and again in the research, that was the point where people said they were happiest. That was the peak of, in our countries, Britain, America, Europe, I think also probably other countries, other developed countries. The 70s was very often the time when most people said that they were happy. We've lost track since then. So if we've got so much more, if we're flying so much more, we've got so much more stuff. Some of us, I realize some people have got less, of course, because there's a lot of poor people. But if we say that as an entire society, we seem to have a lot more stuff, we're burning a lot more fuel, we're certainly emitting a lot more, and we're not happier, well, to be honest, what was that? What the hell was the point of it? And I look back on how things were in the 70s, and we didn't fly a load. In fact, my family never flew anywhere. And you know what? Were we any less happy? No. You just deal with what's there. So, yes, we are going to have technology changes. We're going to have lots of opportunities. I think, for example, to change personal transportation, we're going to have to look at ways of moving out of obviously out of the internal combustion engine and towards electricity, electrical powered cars and so on. But I think we're also going to have to find ways of just simply living differently. And the thing which is really important to stress is that living differently could be a whole load better for people, as indeed many people are already finding, as indeed, right across the developed world there is now a migration back into cities, back into dense living, back into, what we could say, livable communities, places where you can walk to the shops, places which have a sense of community and community hub and centre, because that is a good way of living. Where I live at the moment, I live in the middle of the country, so I need a car sometimes to get around, but I also live in a small town where I can simply walk into town and I'm part of that community. And that is a great way to live.
All right. Well, with that, we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for spending time with us today.
Thank you. I loved being on your show. Thank you.